Hello, everyone. Welcome back. And today we're going to go ahead and be talking a little bit about the modern environmentalist movement. The modern environmentalist movement really is associated a lot with the 1970s. But environmentalism itself goes back a little bit further than that. The classical environmentalist movement really was a development of the progressive era. It focused on both preserving and improving nature. The actions of people like President Teddy Roosevelt in establishing the national park system went a long way towards preserving our natural world. But not only were we trying to preserve it, we were trying to improve it because we felt like at the time that the natural world was meant for human beings, that it was supposed to serve human interests. And so many of the classical environmentalist ideas were focused on what we viewed as improvements to nature. This would include things like dams that would prevent flooding and allow more land open to agriculture. It would include city parks, which made opportunities for people to enjoy nature even in an urban setting. And probably there is no one organization that better represents this classical environmentalist movement than the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club, one of our nation's oldest environmental organizations, was founded in 1892 by a gentleman by the name of John Muir. And again, the focus of the Sierra Club was to preserve nature. But really beginning in the 1960s and 70s, that will start to shift. And that will start to shift in no small part because of a couple of different books that were published. The first book that I would like to talk a little bit about that really does get a lot of the credit for the birth of the modern environmentalist movement is a book by a woman by the name of Rachel Carson. She writes a book called Silent Spring. And she predicts that we will have a spring without the sound of birds. And she focuses a lot on the chemical pollutions in the water and air and things like that. And that she notices that it's having an adverse impact on wildlife. She was really concerned primarily about wildlife, but also expresses concerns about the effects of chemicals on children and on people and things of that nature. In particular, one chemical she really took exception to was a chemical called DDT. It was a pesticide and was used a lot to control, a lot of different diseases like malaria. And so what ends up happening is, after the publication of her book, the United States will go ahead, and eventually most of the world will go ahead and ban the use of DDT. Even though it never showed that it was a carcinogen, in other words, caused cancer, and despite lots of different studies, has been proven to be a relatively safe chemical for use as a pesticide. And the net result of, especially in the developing world, where malaria is still a big problem, is because of the banning of DDT since the 1970s, you probably have an additional 200 to 5 million deaths attributed to malaria that maybe would not have happened had those developing world nations been able to use DDT. And in fact, since then, in recent years, they have gone back on that and have, again, allowed for the use of DDT, especially in developing world countries where malaria is still a significant problem. Again, lots of different adverse effects and things like that, and a lot of different things that took place as a result of Rachel Carson's book. Another book that is probably not as influential, but is nonetheless one that's still remembered a lot, is a book called The Population Bomb. It was written by a biologist by the name of Paul Ehrlich. And this one is really, whereas Rachel Carson's book, we may have been wrong about DDT a little bit, but for the most part, her criticisms have really held. And again, hugely influential book. Paul Ehrlich's predictions, though, haven't held up so well. Paul Ehrlich felt like that we were going to become overpopulated. In fact, he made a lot of predictions that turned out not to be true. He predicted that the world would start to run out of food by 1975. Our population was out of control. That didn't happen. He was predicting that by 1980 you'd have 100 to 200 million people, in addition to the standard deaths, 1 to 2 million people beyond a normal death rate. That would be people dying of starvation by 1980. He predicted wars because you would have people who were desperate to go ahead and feed themselves. And he further said that there's really nothing we could do about it. There was no way to prevent this. It was the cake was baked, and mass starvation was in our future within 10 years. Of course, that was incorrect. We still haven't seen that result, and probably nowhere is that better demonstrated than in 1980. There was an economist by the name of Julian Simon who looked at what Ehrlich had said, is like, well, this just isn't correct. He doesn't understand how scarcity works in economics. And so he challenged Ehrlich. He said, tell you what, you pick 5 resources and that you think, because of scarcity, because we're going to be running out, the price is going to go up. And he goes, I will take a bet that in fact, after 10 years, the prices will have dropped. And so Ehrlich picks 5 resources. I want to say it's like copper and a few other minerals and different things like that, this basket of goods. And they said, okay, this is how much you could buy with $200 of all of these things. And let's come back and see what we can do. And so 10 years later, they come back. And at the end of the day, Paul Ehrlich is writing a check to Julian Simon for like $500-something. He lost the bet. All the products, all the goods, the price had actually gone down when accounting for inflation and stuff like that. And so again, Paul Ehrlich, really kind of known for all of the ways in which his predictions had failed. But nonetheless, the book has a lasting impact because it draws attention to the environment and really draws attention to population. And that is still a trademark of the modern environmentalist movement. There's probably nothing that better illustrates the modern environmentalist movement than Earth Day. Earth Day, the first Earth Day was April 22nd, 1970. It was proposed and started by a guy by the name of Gaylord Nelson. He was a senator from Wisconsin. And he's the guy who kind of tries to push this and get this off the ground. It becomes really one of the largest, in fact, according to most people, the largest single-day protest in the history of our world. It included something like 20 million people all around the world. In no small part, thanks to a union, the United Auto Workers, which seems like a strange place to go ahead and be promoting Earth Day, people who make cars, which today we consider to be one of the main polluters. But the United Auto Workers really went ahead and bankrolled this and supported it. They got their members to come out and support the Earth Day protests. Strange little note about about Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970. I don't think it was planned to be this way, but it actually turned out to be Lenin's birthday. And so sometimes you'll hear people make that association. In reality, Gaylord Nelson, who picked the day, he wanted it to be, he was really targeting college kids. That's why he chose the day. It would be after spring break, so you wouldn't have college kids on vacation. It's after Easter. It's not going to conflict with Easter. The weather's going to be a little warmer, but they're going to be in school. They're not out for the summer yet. So he was really looking to maximize the number of college students who would participate, and that's why he chooses April 22nd, 1970. Although you will hear people bring up the fact that it was actually on Lenin's birthday. Whereas the first environmental movement is really known, the Sierra Club is the organization that really kind of defines the early environmental movement. Greenpeace is a modern day environmental group that a lot of people will point to as kind of being the standard bearer. It's one of the leading environmentalist movements. It was founded by a couple of Americans, Irving and Dorothy Stowe, but they weren't in America when they founded it. They were actually living in Vancouver. So Greenpeace was founded in Vancouver, Canada, and it really becomes the first modern environmental movement that becomes much more of an activist movement, and really a militant movement. They were very much anti-nuclear, especially at the beginning, and so they would go out and aggressively try to stop nuclear tests. Many times would be arrested. So again, a much more militant organization, and that is a characteristic really of the modern environmental movement as opposed to the classical environmental movement. You see this shift from conservation and preservation to a shift more of, we want to restore nature to what it was. We've damaged the earth and we need to restore it, or we need to reclaim nature. You see a lot of this, and we now are tearing down dams as a part of the environmental movement that were really started as part of the environmental movement, and trying to reclaim wetlands and things of that nature. So trying to undo what man has done is definitely a characteristic of the modern environmentalist movement. A lot of the issues in modern environmentalism are things that you're probably familiar with. Things like what was originally called global warming, but they've changed the name to climate change. Overpopulation, again, hearkening to Paul Ehrlich's book. Overpopulation is still a concern you'll hear referenced commonly. in the modern environmentalist movement. The focus on things like air pollution and water pollution and the Endangered Species Act. Those are all things, again, that would be near and dear to Rachel Carson's heart. And then deforestation in the Amazon and things of that nature. These are all issues that are very much a part of the modern environmental movement that weren't necessarily part of the classical environmental movement. And then our response to this, you have the institution of or the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. It's actually established by Richard Nixon in July of 1970. It's actually established not by Congress. There's not an act it's actually established by an executive order. But it's in response to the act that was passed the year earlier, the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. So all of a sudden there's all these different rules and different things, and Nixon decides there has to be an agency which is responsible for implementing this act of Congress, and he then via executive order establishes the Environmental Protection Agency. You get the passage of things like the Endangered Species Act, you have the Clean Water, Clean Air Act, all kinds of things. But it's not just our national government that does a lot. There are certainly international. There's an international component, certainly, to the modern environmental movement. You see the international component coming through with agreements, usually in some way brokered or sponsored by the United Nations. Things like the Kyoto Protocol, which a lot of countries around the world signed on to. The United States never did. The Kyoto Protocol has lapsed, and we've tried to go ahead. The UN has tried to have additional agreements to try to get people to reduce the amount of carbon they're emitting. Again, that goes to global warming and climate change. We tried at Copenhagen and then in Cancun. And the most, I think, recent attempt was the Paris Climate Agreement, I believe in 2017, 2018, around that time frame. So we have these international agreements. You have countries doing things like the United States with the EPA and different pieces of legislation, but those are all modern efforts at trying to go ahead and deal with environmental issues that we face today.